Evolution is what it's ended up being, in particular in the nearshore. It's been a dramatic transformation. The nearshore is a very important bridge between the upland and marine systems, and it is a critical link between the two that kind of make both work.
For a full century, a river in the northwest corner of Washington state lived under a kind of house arrest. Two concrete walls, stacked one behind the other, cut the Elwha River off from the mountains that fed it and the ocean that had always called its fish home. For 100 years, almost nobody believed that arrangement would ever change. And then, in the space of only a few short years, it did. And what happened next stunned even the scientists who had spent their careers waiting for it. This is the story of how a river came back from the edge of ruin, and how a fish that experts had already written an obituary for turned out to have been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Before any of the concrete existed, the Elwha was one of the most extraordinary salmon rivers in North America. It began high in the Olympic Mountains, tumbling down through nearly 45 miles of forest and canyon before reaching the Pacific. What made it remarkable wasn't just its beauty, it was its sheer biological richness. Nearly every kind of salmon and sea-run trout native to the Pacific Northwest used this single watershed. Spring, summer, and fall Chinook, coho, chum, pink, sockeye, both summer and winter steelhead, along with bull trout and cutthroat trout sharing the same water. Few rivers anywhere held that much diversity in one place. The Chinook alone were the stuff of local legend. Fishermen and early explorers told stories of salmon pulled from the Elwha that weighed close to 100 pounds. As far back as the late 1700s, a Spanish explorer recorded buying enormous salmon from the indigenous people who lived where the river met the sea. For the lower Elwha Clallam people, that river wasn't scenery to admire from a distance. It was the foundation of their existence, their food source, their calendar, their spiritual center, woven into daily life for thousands of years. What made the Elwha story especially unusual is that most of its upper watershed sat protected inside what would eventually become Olympic National Park. That meant the river didn't face the slow bleed of pollution, logging, and development that quietly kills so many other salmon rivers. Its habitat, especially higher up, stayed close to pristine. Biologists later calculated that in its healthiest years, something close to 400,000 adult salmon and steelhead returned to spawn in the Elwha annually, a number so large it's genuinely difficult to picture. Rivers so packed with fish that the water itself seemed to move with muscle. All of that abundance rested on a river that, at the start of the 20th century, had no legal protection at all from the ambitions of one man. His name was Thomas Aldwell, and in 1910 he looked at the Elwha's narrow canyon and saw dollar signs instead of fish. He envisioned cheap, reliable hydroelectric power to feed the sawmills and growing industry of nearby Port Angeles. Quietly, he bought up land along the riverbanks, teamed up with a financier from Canada, and began construction on what would become the Elwha Dam, just a few miles from where the river reached the sea. There was already a law on the books that should have stopped him from building it the way he wanted. Washington state had required since 1890 that any dam built across a river include a functioning fish ladder, a passage that would let migrating salmon get around the barrier. Aldwell built nothing of the kind. Worse, in his rush to finish the project, his crew failed to properly anchor the base of the dam into solid bedrock, a shortcut that would haunt the structure for the rest of its existence. In 1912, before the dam was even finished, that weak foundation gave way. The reservoir behind it burst, sending a wall of water and debris crashing downstream. Aldwell rebuilt anyway, and by 1913 the Elwha Dam stood complete, 108 feet of concrete with no way through for a single fish. People noticed what this meant almost immediately. A local game warden began writing letters to state officials as early as 1911, warning that thousands of salmon were massing helplessly at the base of the dam with nowhere left to go, driven by instinct to keep pushing upstream against a wall that would never open. His warnings changed nothing. 14 years later, in 1927, a second dam went up even farther upstream, the Glines Canyon Dam, taller than the first. Between the two barriers, more than 90% of the Elwha's historic spawning habitat vanished behind concrete in a single stroke. The consequences weren't subtle. Salmon and steelhead populations that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands collapsed by something close to 98% over the following decades. It wasn't one dramatic extinction event. It was a slow, grinding decline, generation after generation, until the giant Chinook that once weighed 100 pounds survived only as old photographs and stories told by elders. No run suffered more completely than the Elwha's summer steelhead. These fish enter fresh water during the warm months and then have to hold in the river for months before spawning, which means they depend entirely on cold water refuges upstream to survive the wait. The dams sealed off exactly that cold water, trapping the summer run in the shrinking, overheated lower river with nowhere left to endure the season. By the time modern biologists began careful monitoring, the wild summer steelhead of the Elwha were considered functionally extinct, a population that, for all practical purposes, no longer existed. But the dam that destroyed that run had also, without anyone realizing it, been quietly protecting something else the entire time. When Glines Canyon Dam sealed the upper river, it didn't just block water. It trapped fish above it, including rainbow trout that had been living in that isolated stretch for generation after generation. Here's the detail that turns out to matter more than anything else in this whole story. A rainbow trout and a summer steelhead are genetically the exact same species. The only meaningful difference is behavior. A steelhead migrates to the ocean and returns, while a rainbow trout stays in fresh water for its entire life. The trout trapped above the dam were, in a very real sense, steelhead that had simply never been given the chance to become steelhead. They still carried the full genetic blueprint for migration. They just had no door left to walk through. For 100 years, that door stayed shut, while the tribe and a growing coalition of scientists and conservation groups pushed for the dams to come down. In 1974, a major court decision affirmed the treaty fishing rights of tribes across Washington state, giving new legal weight to the fight. Researchers studying the river reached a conclusion that surprised a lot of people. Simply adding fish ladders to the existing dams wouldn't be enough to bring the salmon back, because the best remaining spawning gravel sat far upstream in water that only a fully free-flowing river could reach. The campaign eventually reached Congress. In 1992, lawmakers passed the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act, and President George H.W. Bush signed it into law, setting an explicit national goal: remove both dams and restore the river's salmon runs. Passing a law, however, turned out to be a very different thing from actually tearing down two dams. Funding fights, political resistance from parts of the timber industry, and local concern over property and power dragged the process out for years. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the federal government finally purchased the dams outright, and it took years more of negotiation among the tribe, the National Park Service, and the city of Port Angeles before an actual removal plan was locked in. Building the dams had taken a handful of years. Deciding legally and politically to remove them consumed nearly a lifetime. When demolition finally began on September 15, 2011, it wasn't the single dramatic explosion many people might have imagined. It was a careful, staged process that stretched across 3 years, with crews working from barges to chip away the concrete in controlled layers, using precise, small-scale blasting on the taller Glines Canyon Dam to break it apart section by section. Notch it, let the river drop and settle. Then notch it again. The reason for all that caution was buried behind the dams. Nearly a century's worth of sediment, roughly 30 million tons of sand, silt, and rock, had piled up in the two reservoirs. Releasing it all at once would have buried the very habitat the project was trying to save. So engineers deliberately paced the demolition to let the river carry a large portion of that sediment downstream gradually, closer to its own natural rhythm. Even paced, it looked violent. For months, the water ran thick and brown, murky enough in places that you couldn't see your own hand just beneath the surface. Some fish and aquatic insects in the lower river couldn't survive the smothering sediment and died. Restoration, while it's actually happening, rarely looks like healing. It looks like a wound. The total cost of the project ran to roughly $350 million, making it, at the time, the largest dam removal ever attempted anywhere in the world. By August 2014, the last remnants of Glines Canyon Dam were gone. For the first time in 100 years, the Elwha ran freely from the mountains all the way to the sea. Nobody knew if the fish would remember the way home. They found out almost immediately that they didn't need to be taught. Within months of the barriers coming down, salmon were already pushing into stretches of river their ancestors hadn't touched in nearly a century. By the summer of 2012, Chinook were moving upstream, with coho and steelhead following into the tributaries soon after. Within about 2.5 years of the first dam's removal, biologists had documented 8 different sea-run species swimming freely above the old dam sites, along with bull trout moving through unobstructed for the first time in generations. Trout counts that stood around 3,000 fish in 2007 climbed past 25,000 by 2019. More than 4,000 Chinook returned in 2022 alone. The river itself changed shape, too. Released sediment built roughly 70 new acres of estuary at the river's mouth, and the seafloor near the coast rose by more than 30 feet as the delta rebuilt itself, reversing decades of shoreline erosion. Then came the discovery nobody had predicted. Researchers surveying the upper river in 2016, just 2 years after the last dam fell, began spotting summer steelhead again, the very run that had been declared functionally extinct. By 2018, a single snorkel survey counted more than 300 wild summer steelhead in water that had held almost none for decades. A population everyone assumed was gone had rebuilt itself in only a few seasons, and geneticists traced the new steelhead directly back to those landlocked rainbow trout that had spent 100 years trapped above Glines Canyon Dam. Their offspring had simply done what their distant ancestors always did, migrated to the ocean and returned transformed, expressing an instinct that had never once been practiced, taught, or passed down by example in a century, yet survived intact anyway. In the fall of 2023, the lower Elwha Clallam tribe opened a small ceremonial fishery for coho, the first time in over 100 years that tribal members could legally fish their own river with dams no longer in the way. It was modest by design, only a couple hundred fish taken from a run of several thousand. But the symbolism was enormous for a community that had waited a century for that moment. The Elwha's recovery didn't stay contained to one river either. When the country later undertook an even larger dam removal on the Klamath River along the Oregon-California border, the Elwha stood as the proof that this kind of restoration could actually work. Within a year of the Klamath dams coming down, Chinook were already spawning in stretches they'd been locked out of for generations. Scientists are careful to note that the story isn't finished. Full recovery to anything resembling historic run sizes is measured in decades, not years, with realistic targets stretching into the 2030s and beyond. A river doesn't heal on a human timeline. It heals on its own. What the Elwha proved in the end is something almost deceptively simple. Salmon and steelhead don't need to be carefully reintroduced or micromanaged back into a river. They need the door left open, and they will find their own way home, often faster than anyone studying them dares to predict. The same concrete that nearly erased an entire run of fish from existence turned out to be the very thing that had preserved its bloodline all along, sealed safely away until the day the wall finally came down and the ocean called them home again.